Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Future World conversation series with Àlex Gómez-Marín. Today, we are joined by our guest, Rebecca Tarnas, who is an assistant professor in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her doctoral dissertation was titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. And her research interest includes depth psychology, archetypal studies, literature, philosophy, and the ecological imagination. Becca is an editor of Archai, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and she's also author of the book Journey to the Imaginal Realm, the Reader's Guide to J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. She's currently researching and writing a biography on Stanislav Grof, a co-founder of transpersonal psychology. And as always, we're joined by Àlex Gómez-Marín, a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist and the current director of the Paris Center. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. Since 2016, he has been the head of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory at the Instituto de Neurociencia in Alicante, where he is an associate professor of the Spanish Research Council. Welcome both. I'll hand it over to both of you straight away.
Thank you, James. And I've missed your introductions. Your very energetic and articulate introductions. Thank you, James. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Becca, for joining us today. We're honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation with you. And wow, thank you everyone for coming to participate on this Wednesday. What a delightful group to be part of.
Yes, and I really appreciate that we still do these things live because given the pace of the times and the ways we're relating to each other, for some reason, it feels very precious to know that while we're doing this, there are actually human beings listening and watching and participating. So yes, welcome to the Future World series. As I was telling you before we went live, to me, this is a practice of the art of dialogos or conversation. This is not an interview, but I'll be asking you lots of questions because I'm very curious. So we don't have really a script where to go, but perhaps a good way to start would be to talk about time, because I don't know if that happens when you ask people, but everyone is so busy and so intensely accelerated lately. And I wonder whether that's the case for you, and also whether from your studies you could help us interpret or understand if there's something going on, whether a kind of singularity is near, or what's going on with time.
I love this topic of time, and it certainly, my entire life, I feel like I have heard people speaking about how time seems to be going faster and faster. And a lot of people reflect on it as, something to do with age. As we get older, it seems like our lives go by more quickly. But I think that it's something that can both be captured in the individual's experience of a lifetime, and then, as you're speaking to, there is a feeling of an acceleration taking place historically. And I think that sense of acceleration has probably been happening at least, through the last century or more. But certainly, since, I can't speak from direct experience. I was born in the late 80s. But my sense is that through the 20th century, and especially since the Second World War, there's just been that increasing feeling of the pace of life, the feeling of an evolutionary process speeding up more and more, that more changes within an individual's lifetime, or even within a generation, than it used to. And I don't have a concrete answer necessarily for that, But my sense is that it may be related to one of the things that we study and teach in the graduate program that I'm a part of, the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS, something to do with an evolution of consciousness, that as we are interconnecting as cultures all around a globe, and recognizing that we're all part of this planet, this moving towards what we might call planetary civilization, there is an acceleration taking place because there's an awareness between individuals that it's like we're moving towards something, if that makes sense. I know you brought up the singularity, and I think there's a number of different other ways that we can think of that kind of coming together. Edgar Morin calls it the planetary era. Teilhard de Chardin calls it the omega point. Owen Barfield calls it final participation. Like there's all these different ways of viewing it, but that's kind of the pull I feel. That's on a very large scale. And
Yes.
then there's the smaller scale of the day to day, and how hard it is to live through that. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like it's tearing apart my psyche, at least. And I'm not sure sometimes if we're being pulled towards something, or if we're running away from something, like in this post-secular age. It seems like we are running because we're trying to get away from something, but then going back, for instance, to the origins of CIIS, right? And the founder was a disciple of Sri Aurobindo, who's a very dear guide, I would say spiritual guide of mine. And he was writing at a time where this idea of evolution of consciousness was very alive, right? With the work of Henri Bergson and others, and the Chardin later. What do you think it means that consciousness is evolving in us? Are we supposed to become something other than human, or are we supposed to realize our humanity in a way we haven't yet? And sorry to start with these big questions without warm up, but we have an hour. There's no time to lose.
There's no time to lose. You know, I was thinking before we started with this theme of the future world, and the fact that you're on one side of the world and I'm on the other side. And so you're coming to this conversation, and I imagine many of the people listening are coming to it with evening consciousness, and I'm coming to it with morning consciousness, which in itself is kind of going to make for an interesting dialogue of the morning and the evening of, you know, do we start with the little things, or do we let's just go for we have to take on the big things. There's no time to do anything else. And in saying that, I totally lost track of the great question you brought up.
Well, what it means for human consciousness to evolve, right? I mean, I threw at you the singularity, which it's of course not property of the transhumanists, right? But it expresses this sense that something is accelerating towards some event, and well, some people disagree and they say this is a very modern way of thinking in terms of progress. But maybe if we go back to spiritual evolution, we are working towards something. And so what do you think that is in terms of human consciousness?
I think, you know, kind of picking up on some of the themes that I was touching on a moment ago, and this has very much been in my awareness in recent years, is this idea of becoming a planetary civilization. That we are, we're certainly not there yet. You know, we're very much divided as a human species. We're divided into nations and races and ethnicities and economic classes, and in that division there's so much conflict, and therefore so much suffering that's inflicted. And at the same time, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that we're all on this one earth together. And so what it feels like that evolution is pushing towards is a reconciliation with that. What is it? You know, you see these bumper stickers sometimes that say, think globally, act locally. And what does it mean to be able to think on that scale, that global scale? I remember a number of years ago thinking about how when different nations are at war with each other, and this kind of impulse for one nation to take over another, like this kind of gaining of territory, that at a certain point you start to realize, wait, we're all on a circle. It's all a globe. It's just, you start, if you have that shift in consciousness, you realize you're just conquering yourself. What does that really mean? And then what is the point of it? And when I say what is the point of it, I'm not by any means dismissing the suffering. I'm recognizing how to become a planetary civilization, we have to be able to feel each other's pain and recognize it as our own, that we have to move beyond this position we've held for far too long of othering people. We can't even do that with other human beings yet, let alone with other species, animal species, plant species. I mean, if the human relationship with itself is so fraught, the human relationship with the earth is just as, if not more so, fraught. And so that's some of, I think, the feeling of acceleration too, because ecologically, if we don't shift our consciousness and relationship to the earth, of which we are a part, we're not separate from it. We are a part of this earth. We've emerged from this earth. Then the time really is running out very, very quickly.
Yes, and yet we don't. I don't want to be
Yeah.
negative here, but we've been hearing this for a long time. We must, we have to, and we kind of don't do it. And so perhaps that's why there's a sense that the world is breaking apart, because maybe the world breaking itself is maybe the only way we can just move on. There's a lot of, I was thinking lately, I was thinking a lot about AI and what may be going on in these algorithms. We may talk about this if you want, about not just the obvious but terrible prospects in terms of democracies and jobs and the economy and so on, but also maybe what it means at the spiritual level, that we humans are spending so much time talking to these bots, and whether we're projecting onto them our consciousness, or maybe there's something more spooky going on there. But in any case, thinking about AI, I realized two things are going on a lot lately. There's kind of fission and fusion. There's confusion, like things that are different are mixed as if they were the same, and things that should be united are separated. Like, you know, a moment ago you were talking about how we are apart, where we could and should be in unity, but at the same time things that are separate are brought together. So it's very confusing. So it's not just acceleration and sense of a world breaking, but it's also a sense that things are being mixed up, and we also have to do a job of putting them in the right order. How does that feel to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of seeing it, that there is this kind of confusion taking place. And you know, I think part of what can happen when there is this sense of acceleration, or things are going through a process of breakdown, is it starts to bring up a lot of internal feelings of panic, and which makes us go faster, and which makes us be less careful. You know, you brought up a moment ago that, well, why is it we don't change in relation to how we relate to the earth, how we extract resources, how we pollute, and so forth. And I think that we've been trying, like environmentalists, ecologists have been trying to appeal to the rational in human beings, through facts, through numbers. And when I was an undergrad, actually, one of my two majors was environmental studies. And I reached this point in that, in my studies, where I felt like this matters so deeply to me, but I feel like it's not being communicated in a way that's actually going to make the change that is being looked for. And so where I ended up going instead in terms of graduate school was looking instead into worldviews, into asking the questions, well, how did we end up in an ecological crisis to begin with? And furthermore, about communication, storytelling. You can't convince people through facts, through numbers, through fear, because we often just get paralyzed in the face of fear. We're either paralyzed or we fight back. We're in denial. You know, there's so many people in denial about the crisis that we're in. And so appealing to different parts of people, where this comes back to that idea of an evolution of consciousness, or a transformation of consciousness, and we can do this at an individual level, to remember, when is a moment in your life where your consciousness was utterly transformed, that you mark it, and it's different, I think, for everybody. But what was that turning point, that conversion moment? And I know there's a lot overlaid on that term conversion, but really, you know, it means a turn. When did one have that turn? And it usually isn't someone just sitting you down and giving you a bunch of facts, or kind of stoking your fear. It's a deeper level that we tap into.
What's a moment that you can remember that happened to you? I mean, for me, there are a few, of course, not so many, but a few. Like going to India was very powerful. Actually, when I went to the ashram of Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry, another one for me was a near-death experience. Maybe a third one was becoming a parent, a father. Although that takes time to integrate, a lot of time. What are those moments for you, if you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I'm happy to share it. You know, probably the biggest one for me was, this is about a decade and a half ago at this point. I had a deeply mystical, spiritual experience that was facilitated by sacred medicine, in which I shifted from understanding concepts like archetypes as a concept, as something that I was learning through school and reading and so forth, a shift to actually being able to perceive them in the world. And it never went away. So even though it happened in this expanded state of consciousness, which, you know, an expanded state of consciousness can be facilitated in many different ways, including a near-death experience. But that shift happened then, and then it never left, where I was suddenly able to perceive the universals that exist behind the particulars of the world. And that was a complete worldview shift for me. It was a transformation of consciousness. And I certainly hold that as a kind of marker from, you could say, you know, a worldview that takes in the world as it is, physically and in its particulars, our emotional resonance with it, so forth, to having a profound experience, not rational knowledge, but an experience of a sacred interiority to the world.
Say more about this. It's fascinating. Please say more about this, because
sure,
you know, we do academic work, and I was going to ask you about archetypes and so on, but now you've surprised me, because it's not just, okay, I'm going to give you the best account, intellectual account of what an archetype may be, but you're telling me that you've had an experience, you've sensed, you've felt, you know, you don't only think about archetypes, you have a knowing of archetypes that's more direct. How to convey that? Help me.
Okay, how do I convey that? So I've had a number of moments where I feel like, oh, Plato is right. You go back and you're like, oh, Plato was right when he was articulating that there are these sacred, eternal, transcendent forms behind the world, living through the world, living through us, that we're participating in. My experience of it is also somewhat different than the Platonic expression of it as, transcendent and separate. But I think perhaps even Plato wasn't fully saying that there is this kind of participatory engagement between the archetypal principles and our lived experience. But one way that I think that can kind of helpfully convey this, that can start to stoke that perception in others, Plato talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the beautiful is one that's easy to grasp in some ways, because if you look at the world and you identify many things that you find beautiful, it could be a beautiful flower that's blossoming. It could be a beautiful sunset. It could be the beauty that you perceive in your beloved's face. It's beautiful, even though each of those concrete things, the sunset, the flower, your partner, are all totally different. But there's this something, this beauty that isn't just our perception, something we're putting on it, something that you can boil down to the particular details. What is it in the rose, or in the angles of someone's face, or in all the colors of the sun? You can't ever get to what makes it beautiful and what doesn't. Instead, you sink into something else, and that shift, oh, that is beauty. But beauty with a capital B, that is that archetypal principle of beauty. And once you start seeing that everywhere, then you can't stop. It's like it becomes more real than what it's living through. But that's the case not just with beauty, but in some ways you could think of all the archetypal principles. And one way in which I've worked with this that makes a more concrete system, and I know when we spoke months ago, this was an interesting topic for you to broach, and I appreciated your open-mindedness about it. But one of the disciplines that I work in, which I've learned directly from my father, Richard Tarnas, and his research, is the field of archetypal astrology. And he spent decades documenting significant correlations that he found between planetary placements and the unfolding of events in human history, and laid out this very convincing evidence in his book, Cosmos and Psyche. And he was just telling me this weekend that he has more evidence piled up than he will ever be able to write of these correlations in biographies, in art, in the news, in politics, in so many historical examples. And so, but what he recognized in these correlations is that associated with each of the planets is an archetypal principle. And so this is actually a map, a way of tracking how these great primordial archetypes express themselves in the world through time, through history, through an individual life, and then through just the countless expressions, both on individual and collective levels. So this is a kind of a language and system where you can perceive and understand and get to know archetypal principles more concretely than maybe the philosophical or even psychological systems we've inherited, whether that's from Plato, to Jung.
Yeah, let's dive into this. And I wanted to talk to you about astrology and
Sure.
make some disclaimers of mine about it and my total ignorance, but my more than curiosity towards it. But before that, let me go back to the archetypes and ask a very, I would say again, a big question in a stupid way. what do these archetypes want from us? Like they like, you know, they sound like they live in that space. I don't know if that's the Platonic space where, you know, everything is kind of eternal and even perfect and unchanging. What's in it for them? That's why I say it's a stupid way of asking it, of ingressing into our own world, in the world of change. I mean, do they? I asked Mike Levin a similar question a few months ago when he was disclosing his Neoplatonism, and I asked him, well, sure, these ideas ingress in our particular world, but what do they gain by doing that? You see, so what's in it for the archetypes in giving us or in mapping, or whatever the right word is, into the world of particulars that where we live?
I'd answer that in a similar way as we might, if one holds the perspective that the divine incarnated to, it's funny, I was thinking more in a non-dual sense, like the divine divides itself into the many to become the world of creation. But as I said that, you can also think of the divine incarnating in the Christian sense. You can, that'll take us too far afield. But it's this idea of, I think the impulse is for the eternal to have an experience, to evolve, to be in relationship. So I love thinking about archetypal theory and kind of putting together from the many other theorists and experiencers of archetypes across, the philosophical millennia, an understanding that resonates with what I've experienced and what others whose work I really respect have described. And one kind of schema that made a lot of sense to me, I actually drew from Whitehead, who, disclaimer, I don't understand Whitehead all that well. But one thing I took away from Whitehead was his understanding of God as having a primordial pole and a consequent pole, or you could think a kind of eternal side and an evolving side. I thought, oh, that's what archetypes are like. They have this eternal quality, which is what Plato describes, but then they also evolve. And because every time an archetypal principle enters into the world through our lived experience, through anything in manifestation, then by going through that experience, it undergoes an evolution that then in some ways returns back and informs the eternal pole, which is, you could say, the realm of potentia, what could exist but doesn't, versus what does exist and therefore is changed by it. And so I see it as this kind of eternal evolutionary dialogue that's taking place. And what's interesting in terms of archetypes is that they're many, they're multiple. There isn't just, one archetype. If we kind of push that further back, you could think of maybe the refractions of a one unified divinity. I'm speculating here, but because they're many, that when they enter into the world, into experience, they come into relationship with each other. And I think that's the same thing, you can understand it from our own human experience, that we're not going through life just isolated to be alone. We have to, want to, need to relate to each other, because every time we relate to another person, we're changed, we're transformed. And that's the same thing with these archetypal principles, is they encounter each other to come into relationship, to be changed, to become something new, which then opens up new possibilities for future expressions. And that, one last thing I'll say on that is, that's where I find it really exciting, is that if we as human beings recognize that we are and can consciously participate in that evolutionary process of the archetypes, that they're not just eternal and unchanging, we can open up new ways for them to express themselves. We can evolve the story. And if enough people are doing that in a conscious way, we can actually start to shift that toward a more life-enhancing, more harmonious, beautiful, creative form.
Yeah,
So,
that's another
yeah.
way of answering the first questions we were discussing about evolution in an unexpected way. Yeah, thank you for that. Can you name, let's jump into astrology in a moment, but can you name a few of those archetypes? Like give us a palette of them, like 5, 6, 7. I mean, how to think about them? Because I'm not sure everyone, including myself, would be able to name you 12 of them. So give us some sense of what these are.
So it's interesting when it comes down to naming archetypes, because that depends more on which system you're using to approach them. So, for example, the way Plato talks about it, he speaks about there isn't kind of a fixed number for Plato. It's more that behind every individual thing, there's a perfect form that's kind of like the capitalized form of that. So behind all the particular trees, there's one perfect archetypal form of tree with a capital T. Or behind all the horses, there's a, capital H horse. When you get to Jung talking about psychological archetypes, he speaks about them more as figures. And I think that in our contemporary context, that's usually what people think of when they hear archetype. They think of a figure, like, and we see this in the tarot too. Like there's the hermit, there's the king, there's the queen, there's the trickster, there's the magician. So that's often what people think of. Interestingly, it took me a long time to get there and realize that's what people think of when they think of archetypes, is they think of these more humanoid figures. So I always call those archetypal figures. And this is why I brought astrology up, is because astrology actually provides us with a really elegant system to understand really kind of broad, complex, multivalent archetypes through the planets. And so usually when I'm perceiving archetypes, it's through 10 planetary archetypes: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And with each of those, now you're just hearing me name planets, but with each of those, there's like a whole universe of particular archetypal expressions. So Venus, for example, is the archetypal principle of love, beauty, romance, attraction, desire, the arts, aesthetics, anything that we find pleasurable or enjoyable or beautiful or engaging. So as I'm describing that, you're hearing lots of particular words, but there's probably some intuitive part of you that's like, oh yeah, I can see how those all hang together. It's almost like they're all metaphors for each other. Or the archetypal principle of Saturn. Saturn is the archetype of time, back to our original theme, of time, of finitude, of endings, of loss and pain and suffering and death and mortality. But it's also structure and grounding and responsibility and maturity and wisdom. So again, lots of different words, but it's almost like they're metaphors for one another. James Hillman, who's he's an archetypal psychologist who is, one of the best articulators of archetypes there is. He says every way of speaking of archetypes is translations from one metaphor to another. So all that is to say, how we identify or how we name archetypes depends what system we're approaching them through. So the one that I typically approach them through is the astrological system. But you can approach them through like a Jungian psychological system that, again, recognizes more figures of the psyche. So that's
would
both an
happen?
answer and not an answer.
No, yeah, sure. No, I really want to learn from you about this because I literally know nothing about it. What would that's the typical stupid scientist question. So here it goes. What would happen if now a big rock came or a huge asteroid came and just smashed a planet and it disintegrated? What would that do? What would that physical change in our solar system do to the archetypes? Like now we wouldn't have Mercury, for instance, so we would have it split in two parts. Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this because I think it's a way for me and maybe others to start thinking about these maybe acausal correlations between the physical world, you could say astronomy, and then what astrology offers, which, by the way, and maybe that's the moment to say it, when as a scientist you have to make a list of pseudoscience, astrology, I don't know, always wins. There's
Number one.
Yes,
Yep.
there's something people really hate about astrology. But actually, now that I work on themes that where I'm sometimes suspicious of pseudoscience too, I've had to reflect more carefully on what people meant, and it's strange because, well, there's people doing all sorts of things, but a lot of the time when people speak about astrology, they don't pretend it is science as when we speak about chemistry. Therefore, the accusation of pseudoscience is immediately out. They're not posing or pretending to be scientists doing that. But at the same time, well, if it's speaking about another kind of relations in the world which are not efficient causes, not even causality, maybe just correlations, well, we could attend to that. And what's the big deal? Just to finish that, actually, in my renaming of number one pseudoscience, because it's hard. Like, okay, once you understand the demarcation problem and what's science and what's not, and why people do that, what's the psychological reason for attacking this and that, and I've came to the recent conclusion that the biggest pseudoscience is materialism, actually, because it is presented as science, and it is not, and it is pervasively and perniciously presented as what science is and finds and says, and it's a philosophical system. So actually, and it's so ironic. And with this, I'll wrap it up and hand it back to you. It's so ironic that those who typically would just freak out if a scientist is talking about astrology are typically materialists, who now I see as the biggest pseudoscientists of all when they present, their ideology as actual, as if it was a scientific fact. So anyways, how to think about that? So back to the stupid thought experiment of now Mercury just disintegrates.
So it's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it in an almost inverse way. So first of all, if Mercury was, as a physical planet, smashed, the archetypal principle correlated with Mercury of the mind, thinking, communication, exchange, education, learning, ideas, that wouldn't just vanish, because the archetypal principle pre-exists the physical planet. I'm going to answer this in an inverse way, though, which actually has a historical grounding, which is that astrology, for most of its history, worked with the 7 visible planets, or really the 5 visible planets and the 2 luminaries, the sun and the moon. And then in 1781, using a telescope, William Herschel discovers Uranus. And that breaks the old cosmos. The Copernican revolution had already totally reordered the cosmos, putting the sun at the center, realizing the Earth as a planet is also a wanderer. But now Saturn isn't the end. It isn't the bounds of the universe at all. There's a planet beyond it. And then less than a century later, Neptune is discovered. Less than a century after that, Pluto's discovered. And there are very profound transpersonal archetypes that are associated with these 3 outer planets. And interestingly, it's these ones that we see most prominently in world transits, these kind of long cycles of planetary alignments, which again is what Rick Tarnas traces in his book Cosmos and Psyche. So I won't go into this for too long, but just to give an example, when Uranus and Pluto come into alignment, it always correlates with major revolutionary periods, whether that's the 1960s or the French Revolution. Every time these two come into alignment, we just see a kind of eruption of revolutionary energy. The most recent alignment of those two was the square from 2007 to 2020, and the world erupted in protests, in massive cultural transformations. And so many people were drawing parallels between that time and the 60s. And so did those archetypes not exist before those physical planets were discovered? They absolutely exist. And the historical record shows it. We go back far enough and we see, again, these historical correlations long before humanity knew these planets were there. So what's going on? I think what the planets afford us is a tracking system to see the timing of when these different archetypes come into relationship with each other and become dominant in the collective sphere, become a form of perception in the collective. But clearly they exist before we have an awareness of the planets. So something that I was thinking about the other day was there are something that astrologers have identified with those three outer planets is that they call them higher or deeper octaves of some of the inner planets. There's a lot of similarity between the archetype of Mercury and the archetype of Uranus. They're both tricksters. They both kind of bring change and so forth. But they're operating at different levels. Same with Venus and Neptune, Mars and Pluto. Like a good example between Mars and Pluto. Mars is the god of war, mythologically, but you can think of Mars as like the fire, the warrior with the sword. You can think of Pluto as like the erupting volcano and the atomic bomb. They're both violent. They're operating at totally different levels. And so what I was thinking about, it's almost like these archetypal principles that had been historically associated with Mercury, Venus, and Mars felt like, okay, as part of our evolution, let's connect with these outer planets and express ourselves through that so that so human beings, when they discover us in that form, can start to see these larger cycles that are unfolding. So again, back to that original theme of why would archetypes, what's the point of ingressing? What's the point of manifesting in the world? It's so they can evolve. And it's almost like by being associated with these newly discovered outer planets, we can recognize a different pattern of evolution taking place. So it's connected to the bodies, the planetary bodies, but it also isn't. If you read old alchemical texts, you can see the qualities that we empirically recognize in correlations with the positions of the three outer planets. You see those qualities carried by the inner planets in Mercury and the sun and the moon. So archetypes are both, they have kind of a center of meaning, but they're fluid. They shift in terms of, they're not concretely divided, if that makes sense. So if Mercury
how to
was
think about their, sorry, I was gonna, this fluidity, how to think about their influence, meaning, we could phrase in terms of causality. So are these cycles affecting us? Are we affecting them? What about time and fate? I mean, are things gonna happen? So what can you say about these two big concepts, right? Metaphysical and physical, which are causality, like where's the arrow flowing, and even how to even conceive that where the planets are is gonna affect global consciousness? Like, is there any carrier of that information? And also, what does that say about time, about what's going to happen? Because the way I understand astrology, which is, really, really reduced, is that it's not about forecasting. Divination is not about necessarily forecasting or telling the future. It's about kind of reading what's going on here and now. Yeah, so
Right, discerning
again,
the patterns.
yes, so
Yeah.
difficult questions, but because I also want to ask you about Tolkien, about Jung, and about Grof, like, and we maybe have 10 minutes for that. But yes, say more about astrology and how to understand space, causality, and time.
All right,
In
10 minutes.
in 2 minutes, yeah.
Free
let's
will, fate, time, causality. Let's do it. So in terms of causality, this has been a question from as far back as we know with people engaging with the astrological tradition. And this question of, are the planets causing these events to happen, or are they signs? Are they a correlation? And certainly the perspective I hold and other archetypal astrologers hold is that it can be understood more in the sense of how Jung described a synchronicity, that it's a meaningful coincidence between events unfolding on Earth and the planetary positions. A metaphor that Rick Tarnas uses, and a lot of other astrologers use too, is if you look at a clock and it says that it's 12 noon, that clock isn't causing it to be 12 noon. It's indicating that's what time it is. And so the planets in our solar system can be understood in the same way. It's like this cosmic clock that's saying this is the quality of time right now. And I think there's actually even a kind of hint in the name astrology, astrologos. It's the language of the stars. So not the causality of the stars, it's the language. It's how a deeper cause, an archetypal cause, is being communicated to us. And so being able to read the positions of the planets is just learning a language that tells us about these patterns and therefore tells us about ourselves. And so in that way, fate or free will, some people can see that as fate in terms of, oh my goodness, I was born with this birth chart and now I have these complexes and I have to deal with them for the rest of my life. Or you can recognize it as a kind of liberating gift, that you can see the patterns of which you are made, and in becoming conscious of them, you can live them in a way that feels more participatory, liberatory, that it, kind of brings a self-awareness to it. And, there's still days where I'm like, man, it does sometimes feel like fate. You're in a bad mood and you look at the position of the moon and, oh man, of course it's in that particular alignment. Do I have any free will here? But that moment of becoming aware of it, you realize you do, because you're just unconsciously playing into something that's kind of possessing you, and becoming aware of it can actually help lead you out of it.
Yeah,
So,
like the planets become kind of mirrors for your own psyche.
Exactly.
How do you use it? But how do you use it in your daily life? Are you like, did you check what's going on today because we were going to have this conversation, or in really important moments of your life, not this one? And do you see it beforehand or after the fact to kind of make sense of it? How is that practically used?
So for me personally, I work with it all the time in a very fluid way. So I think for this conversation, I just agreed to the date. I didn't look up the transits. But if someone asks me, do you want to give a workshop for us? We have these 3 dates open. I'll look, and I'll look at what the transits are on that day and how they relate to my chart, and which one I think is going to best support the theme of the talk and the reception of it. I'm very blessed to have a husband who also works in archetypal astrology, so it's very much a part of how we work in relationship to each other, and it's helped us so much in terms of having a good relationship, because, if we're really in something, we can recognize, oh, this transit's going on right now. Let's be conscious of how we're living that. Or, oh, I really see that dynamic between our two charts playing out. Let's redirect it. And we have really made it a major part of our lives. We actually chose, we chose the exact chart that we got married under. We even had the audacity to choose the chart, the birth chart for our son being born, which is a very challenging thing to do. You're lining up a lot of different cycles, and you don't know, because obviously it's, there's a major element of grace, and is the soul going to even choose this chart to come through? But he did. He was born within hours of the time that we hoped, thought, intended that he might, which was amazing. And now we get to watch this little being grow up as an embodiment of a beautiful set of transits that we thought, gosh, what's going to happen at that time? And now we get to see. So it is a very major part of how we live our lives, just because we feel like it lets us be in more alignment with the cosmos, and also to be more psychologically self-aware, relationally aware. Helps, keep certain things in check too. Keeps you humble.
One more about this, because I'm, again, very curious. Given that you're literate in the language of the stars, as you put it, what's coming? What's coming?
What is coming? So it's a very complex decade that we're in right now. There's some decades or some periods of time that are defined by one big alignment. Like the 1960s, there was this Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and that just dominated the 60s. We all know, when we think of the 60s, like, oh wow, what a time to be alive. So much change and transformation, and just, kind of extraordinary period of cultural transformation. Or the 90s, there's this Uranus-Neptune alignment, which had a lot of kind of idealism and sense of, multiculturalism and spiritual unity and oneness, and so forth. This decade is interesting because there isn't just one big alignment like that defines it. The beginning of the decade started pretty dramatically. There was a Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto triple conjunction that correlated with the COVID-19 pandemic starting. Other times that we've had Saturn-Pluto in hard alignment like that, both world wars started, 9/11 happened, like it tends to correlate with some really intense things. So it would take so much more time than we have to kind of properly lay out what's going on right now. So I'll just speak to one theme, which is that there's currently a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the sky. It's going to be with us through it started last year. It's going to be with us through 2027. Saturn-Neptune, Saturn is the principle, it's the reality principle. It's like hard, concrete, material reality, consequences. It's a very serious kind of archetype. And Neptune is the total opposite of that. It's transcendent, it's ideal, it's sacred, it's numinous, it's ineffable, it's the invisible. It's the world of images and dreams and imagination and enchantment. So you can kind of see these two don't totally get along. And what can happen when Saturn and Neptune come into alignment is there can be a lot of feeling of disillusionment, of malaise, of anxiety, of non-specific anxiety, a feeling of like the dream is ended, or all dreams have ended, or questioning the divine, being very skeptical. There's often a feeling of like great tragedy unfolding. And so that's what we're in right now. And I think we can probably see that at a global level, where there is a larger feeling of, that sense of anxious disillusionment, crisis. A lot of mental health issues come to the fore under Saturn-Neptune alignments. A lot of water crises. Neptune can be very literally water. A lot of water crises. And so what I always say to people when they're entering into a Saturn-Neptune period, whether it's in the world transits or a personal transit, is it's a good time to really hone the structures of your spiritual discipline, to have something that kind of always brings you back, whether you're feeling grief or loss or anxiety, something that anchors you. Spiritual community, spiritual practice, so that instead of Saturn acting like this sea wall that's keeping out our relationship to the spiritual, to the divine, to the sacred, because that can happen. There really can be a collective feeling of, oh, that, God has left us. God is dead, which Nietzsche, born with Saturn, Neptune, declared under Saturn, Neptune. It's a very kind of Saturn Neptune phenomenon, that idea of God is dead, the divine has left, the sacred isn't here. And our participation in that is shifting that kind of Saturnian blockade and negation of the Neptunian spiritual to turning it into something like a stone bowl that can hold those waters for us. But we have to actively engage that. We have to actively create and participate in it. So it's Saturn Neptune's not the easiest, and at the same time there's a great nobility to it. The last time Saturn Neptune was in hard alignment was from 2014 to 2017. So just can look back on that period for the last time these energies were in the field. And if anyone wants to read a beautiful article about Saturn Neptune, Rick Tarnas wrote an article called The Ideal and the Real, Saturn Neptune, that's available for free on our Archai journal website. So just look up Saturn Neptune Archai, you'll find it. It has it's the first of a 2-part essay, and it'll give you a strong taste for what we're in right now.
I'll read it. As you were saying all of this, Becca, I felt kind of cradled into the imaginal. It's interesting because I don't understand what you're saying, really. I mean, I do, but I don't speak that language yet, right?
Sure,
but
sure.
There's something about me being carried to this, I would say it's the imaginal realm, like this third space. Well, thank you for that. Time has run out, but I hope in the questions people ask those things. Maybe last for you, I knew it would fly. Another impossible question to answer in n seconds or n minutes, whatever that is, whatever you need. No, don't hurry it. Why have you chosen Jung and Tolkien and now working on Grof? What about this constellation of these 3 giants? Anything you want to share about that, their work, your inclination towards them, what you've discovered, what you're curious, anything about this? Incredible. More than thinkers. They're more than thinkers, obviously.
The great men who I research and write about.
Yes.
It's been my fate so far to write more about great men than great women, but I plan to go in that direction at some point. So Jung and Tolkien, Tolkien has been a love of mine since I was 9 years old, and I was drawn to wander in Middle Earth and never really left. And so my work with Jung and Tolkien actually kind of came about because of discovering a synchronicity that when Jung's Red Book was published in 2009, and I was looking at it, and at that point I was an undergrad, I didn't really know much about Jung at all. And I thought, my gosh, this looks like something out of Middle Earth, and it's called the Red Book, and Tolkien has a Red Book of Westmarch. And so a number of years later, that ended up becoming my dissertation topic, was finding that not only did each of them have a Red Book, but there were like dozens upon dozens of parallels between the two. So that's what my dissertation is about. I'm in the process right now of looking to get that published as an actual book. So keep your eyes open for a book on the 2 Red Books. But simply put, what I found in exploring all these parallels between the two in terms of timing, images, scenes that they wrote down, was this sense that, oh, they both entered into this place that we can call the imaginal realm, as you just brought up. They both had these experiences of the imaginal realm, and they came back and described them in different but surprisingly parallel ways. And so then in terms of Grof, this has been a really beautiful unfolding. I've known Stan Grof since I was born, and he and my father collaborated on their research starting at Esalen Institute in the 1970s. And this is actually where all the research on archetypal cosmology came out of, was recognizing that it was an extraordinary timing tool to understand what kinds of experiences individuals would have in psychedelic sessions and holotropic breathwork sessions. No other psychological test, no other system was able to predict the kind of experience people had, except transit astrology, which, as they say, was even more controversial than the psychedelics themselves.
Yes, even worse, yes.
So I've been learning from Grof for many years, and the opportunity arose that that he and others around him were looking for someone to write his biography. And I was in a good position in terms of my projects at the time and my own scholarship and familiarity with his work to be able to take that on. So I've been doing the research for the last several years. Things slowed down a bit in the last year because I had a baby, but I'm planning on getting that completed within the next couple years, and it has been amazing to tell Stan Grof's story. I mean, what an amazing drama this man's life has been. He's almost 95 years old, and the things that he has seen and experienced internally and externally. So, but I think what all of them hold in common is an understanding that there is more to the world than the modern worldview allows us to see. They're all pointing towards what is the next paradigm? Where are we going after this? And that's definitely what I'm interested in. So hence my telling their stories in different ways.
Monumental work. Yeah. Good luck. And
thank you so much.
And thank you for doing this. Yes. All right. Well, you're now in my list of my favorite wonderful cosmic detectives, like, exploring all of these parallels running through and across and beyond. Thank you, Becca.
Thank you so much. It's so enjoyable to talk with you.
All right. James, let's see if there are questions.
Well, thank you both for the past hour. Just from the chat, I can see that everyone was hooked to their screens. The chat has just been going throughout this past hour. Lots of topics touched, both in your conversation and the chat. But yes, let's hear from our audience. As always, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your digital hand or even write your question in the chat and I can read it out for you if you feel more comfortable with that. But we've got Raymond straight off who wants to come in.
Yes, thank you very much for your wonderful talk and for your work. My question has to do with Jung's notion of the ego and the self, and if there's a relationship to this archetypal conjunction between Saturn and Neptune. In my own feeling, I think we're moving evolutionarily, personally, away from the ego and towards the self. And yet the ego is resisting giving up its tyrannical reign. And as Ian McGilchrist would say, the emissary wants to remain in control, whereas the master is the self. I just wonder if there's any relationship between Saturn and Neptune, ego and self.
That's a good connection, because in some ways Saturn is a principle that can be very guarded and defended. I think of Alan Watts' term, the skin encapsulated ego. Like Saturn does that, encapsulating it, gives us a sense of being concrete and isolated, material, And Neptune is that principle of oneness, of wholeness, of unity.
Yes.
And, you know, Jung defined the self in a lot of different ways, but the self really can be, I think, understood of that shift to when we recognize that we are the many archetypal principles living through us, not just that one particular part. And so, yeah, that's a really great connection that you've made between Saturn, Neptune, and the ego self axis. Jung was born with Sun Neptune, so he really has that ability to identify, which is the sun, with the Neptunian, with the whole, with the self, with the archetypal principles. Yeah, thank you for that, Raymond.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond, for coming in. Next, let's bring in Lena. Hi, Lena.
Unmute. There you go. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very, very interesting. I resonated with so much stuff that you said. I was just wondering what your opinion was. Like at the beginning, we were saying we're divided and stuff, but I feel like I tend to see humanity as a holistic view of a human being. So I feel like humanity is that adolescent type of, time. And before we were all separated, like all the nations were separated and not interconnected. Today, the connection between the whole world is incredible. And if we look at, I've been interested in the Renaissance period right now. I'm just studying because I like it. And I realized how hard it was because the nations were coming together, and even medieval time, we were at war, like incredibly, so we were so we've never been technically at peace as much as we are now when you think about it, really, because before it was even worse. And I the fact that we're being able to be connected that way with the internet, but also with traveling. I travel a lot and I live in different countries, and most of my friends are foreigners from my nations. And the fact that we know people on the individual level makes us understand so much more about, like the other nations. And I find that they bring us together much more than ever before. And when you think about it, COVID was the first time that the whole world was experiencing the same thing at the same time, and we all knew about it. There's something about unity when you think about it, that it brought us together. I know it. I mean, I'm not saying it's a perfect thing, but we know that all of those important events in the world have an impact because they make us rethink things and stuff. So I feel like we are not separated. I mean, we are, but we are. There's a shift, according to me, that's bringing us closer and closer. As I said, let's say I've lived in many countries, and most of my friends are foreigners. I share this with my family that doesn't go anywhere, hardly. And that brings in another dimension of other people, of other nations that are different. And there would be racism, let's say, for example, no? Which is dividing us. But for me, sharing the one-on-one knowledge that I have people of these other nations, just open up this mind of the people around me that don't go. So I feel, on the contrary, that we are on that movement, going in understanding, and even the understanding the planetary, like language like this will help me also understand more why another person reacts that way or something. So I don't know, for me, there's a movement towards unity.
Absolutely. I think what you're articulating speaks to what we're moving towards, and what Alex and I were talking about at the beginning in terms of moving towards what we might call a planetary civilization. I was just acknowledging the fact that we're not there yet, and that there is still so much division and othering and conflict and suffering that we're inflicting on each other.
To beat, like, not to, separate. When you only stayed with your nation, it was easier because we're disconnected before. Like, it's only now that that we are connected to so many differences and stuff. You know what I mean? So
absolutely. And that has been largely it's been a very recent shift. And so I think
Yeah.
we're in the midst of the chaos of that shift
Yeah.
too, because that brings up a lot in terms of, you know, the impulse to separate again too, of like, no, this is my culture, this is your culture, don't appropriate, don't, you know, so all those tensions I think are being worked out right now. But I absolutely agree with what you're experiencing and perceiving.
Even
and the
people
movement
from two
underneath that.
different nations making babies that have dual, you know, dual citizenship. So that's what I see when a lot of my friends that I have a parent from a nation and another parent, there's something about them, and like their mind is expanded, and there's room for a lot more understanding, or, you know, and that didn't happen before. So
it's part of the process.
yeah, we're in the process.
Thank
But I
you.
just want people to feel that we are in that process and not be discouraged, like this separation is something, you know what I mean? Like I would love people to say, okay, we're on our way.
Yeah, and I think that's what Alex and I were speaking about, was that trajectory that we're perceiving and intuiting, and that you're speaking to as well.
Regarding
Thank you.
Lina's question, very briefly here, and I really hope there'll be time for the other three questions. Can you say something, Becca, about the planetary astrology and the archetypes of different nations? This is a politically incorrect question to answer, right? Like, is there something about Russia, about the United States, about Spain right now that's happening that can help us understand how to best or how to better address what's going on?
Yeah, so nations have birth charts from when they're founded, and you know that's easier to identify for some more than others. Like the United States, we have an exact birth chart based on when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So you know, different. You can identify different nations' birth charts, and you can definitely see something of their character in those charts. You can also see their transits. For example, the United States is going through its first Pluto return. Individual human beings never go through a Pluto return because we don't live to be 248 years old, but nations do. Empires do. We actually saw the Roman Empire go through 2 Pluto returns. And Pluto is the archetype of death and rebirth, of the eruption of the shadow from the depths, from the underworld, the transformations, destruction it brings about. I think we're seeing that happen in the United States. And so that's been going on. It's about a decade-long transit that really peaked. It's still kind of peaking. It was at its exact alignment in 2022, but these are larger patterns, kind of the end of the last decade through the end of this decade. So yeah, absolutely. Astrology sheds a lot of light on national dynamics, international conflicts, and so forth. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Lina. Still quite a few questions to go through, but next we'll go to Alan, who I believe I'm going to see in a couple days here in Paris.
Oh, great. Excellent. Thank you. Alex mentioned Sri Aurobindo, and I really have, well, a comment and a question, re Eastern versus Western. Now, as a boy, astronomy was a hobby of mine, so I have always really struggled with astrology. But I am aware that Eastern astrology, which is very ancient and very sophisticated, is significantly different. I know there are 9 planets in Eastern Jyotish, I believe it's called, astrology, which includes 2 shadow bodies, and I believe takes account of precession. So I'm just mentioning there is this difference, but as I say, I really struggle with all of astrology. But really, my question is, this presentation started talking about consciousness evolving. And what really puzzles me, if one takes the Eastern perspective, it isn't evolving. And in fact, I would say it can't evolve, but I think it's more to do taking an Eastern perspective of access to consciousness. So I think from the Indian philosophy, one would say there are less access to higher realms than there used to be. Everything is becoming more physical. And when we try and explain things now, certainly in the West, we always seem to start with the physical and then try and work upwards, as opposed to the other way around. And there's certainly evidence in this in terms of spiritual practices. What you can certainly trace throughout the last few thousand years, I think, in terms of India, of Indian Eastern philosophy, is that spiritual practices are becoming more and more easy to cope with humanity being capable of less and less. So it's certainly not consciousness, as it were, evolving. Perhaps you could comment on that, please.
That's a great point. And there's a lot there. So let me just kind of think through how I want to approach this without taking an hour to respond. I think that the dialogue between, these very broad categories, East and West, is a very fruitful dialogue. And the spiritual traditions that have been cultivated in the East have arrived millennia before anything happening in the West at a very profound understanding of interiority. Again, I'm speaking very broadly, very simply. And it seems that much of the Western trajectory has been a journey of exteriority. And in this meeting of the two, they're I love that we use these terms, East and West, to describe them because they're directions, but directions on a globe. Now, I live in California, so I happen to live in a place that really feels like it's a meeting point of that Eastern and Western movement or trajectory, and teach at a school that has been about that integration, where it is this kind of movement both inward and outward. We go so far in that we find ourselves on the outside. We go so far out that we find ourselves on the inside. I hear you with your struggles with astrology, and I won't get into that too much. There are some common roots between Jyotish and Hellenistic astrology, which is the root of the Western astrological tradition. So even there too, we think of these divergent east-west paths. There's a lot in common between them. We use the nodes of the moon in the West. They have Ketu and Rahu in Jyotish. But where I was going with that is in terms of astrology in the Western journey of that, is that there's basically been this trajectory towards the scientific, the materialist, and then a recognition that in that perspective, what we've left out is the psychological, the unconscious interior. You start diving into the psychological, and before you know it, the patterns of our psyche are actually best articulated by the positions of the planets. You go so far in that you find yourself on the outside. And likewise in spiritual practices, you go so far. You treat your physical body in such a way that with yogic postures and so forth, that you transcend. So it's interesting. I guess what I'm kind of talking around is that there are all these movements, inward, outward, east, west, that are all ultimately pointing to one world or one experience that has this interiority, exteriority as essential parts of a larger whole. I hope that makes sense.
That's really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'll see you in a few days. Next, let's go to Veronica.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. I've been reading your father's books for decades.
Oh.
And I'm so glad you are the continuation of that heritage. It's wonderful to have you. Àlex was starting with time. And you might have answered the question, and I may not have understood, but as a global unit on this planet, at least, since we are feeling time so viscerally as of late, even biologically as well, would it be possible, you think, to propose that we are actually creating time? Not in the psychological sense, of course, we know a minute can seem an eternity, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, in science now, I mean, it's a struggle between the nature of consciousness and the nature of time. It's fascinating, but we don't know where to start. So maybe because we need to go faster as a unit, we're speeding up, but we are doing it as conscious agents. I mean, what do you think about that?
That we are speeding time up through our conscious kind of participation in it, evolution in it.
Yes.
I think a certain level of it is conscious and a certain level of it is unconscious, where it feels like it's happening to us, and that can kind of go back and forth in the moment. You know, or certain things that have been intended to give us more time that seem to give us less time. You know, I think a lot of people bring up the subject of like email, for example. Oh, that was supposed to be so much faster. You know, we can communicate right away. Suddenly we have 10,000 emails that we don't know what to do with. And that takes up time that we were never devoting to that to begin with. Yeah, I think there's multiple things happening simultaneously in terms of that. But I appreciate the perspective that you're bringing in there.
Yes, I would only add, Veronica, that yeah, I think you pointed to something that's quite right. It's not just that time is speeding up as if you know, like, you know, sometimes people think about space as a container. Now time as something that's traveling fast and we are on it. Probably what's going on is that there's some noise there. Anyways, that there's some processes, and I don't want to sound cognitive here. There's something about our consciousness. Maybe it's because we're in this kind of transition state where, as we see in physics, like correlations are long range. So there's this kind of state of criticality going on in our consciousness. And probably that's what gives us the impression that time is going faster. So maybe you were pointing to that idea that it's actually something happening in consciousness that then gives us the experience of time running, as opposed to time is going fast for some cosmological reason and we're on it, just feeling it go faster. I think it's more the former, not the later. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Let's see, we might be able to get one, maybe two questions in, but next let's go to Paul.
Thanks, Becca. And thanks, Àlex, and thanks, James. My question is, and I don't want to bring in another author, but I've been reading Irreducible by Federico Fagin. I don't know if you've read the book, but he talks about consciousness units as being fundamental. And I wonder whether archetypes are conscious in the sense that they pattern interiority, which is mind, as an underpinning of exteriority or matter.
I think so. I like the way that you're proposing that. I do think that they pattern interiority and therefore shape our perception. Like the very interesting thing when you track world transits or even personal transits is that the same concrete event can happen, but the people respond to it differently depending what transits are happening, because it shapes our perception of what that event is and what the potential of it is, which then has a different outcome that unfolds. And so in that way, I would say that they underpin not just mind, but psyche. Psyche is that interior realm as well. Does that help? Does that speak to what you're talking about?
While you were speaking of the patterning effects of archetypes, Fajin's comments around, excuse me, consciousness units. And ultimately, he has a reference to something where the consciousness units that interact, or their relational interaction, are called seites. Now, seites are the almost like the conscious, the meta-consciousness of fundamental consciousness. And I found it sort of interesting that you were talking about, you know, archetypes almost as if they could induce or activate consciousness from a fundamental sort of basis. And anyway, that resonated, and I wondered what you thought about that, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you. I'll let another question.
Thank you. Thank you for the book recommendation too.
Oh, it's well worth reading. Àlex has probably read it. Have you, Àlex?
Yes, I have. Yes. Yes, and I had Federico here a few months ago. I don't recall exactly when, but in one of those monthly live conversations. Totally.
Yeah. Amazing work. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Paul. So this hour and a half has gone way too quickly. So I guess we should start wrapping up. I would like just to bring it back to you two, Àlex and Becca. Do you have any final comments to give us?
Oh, I always feel, and of course today as well, grateful for having this opportunity of talking to amazing people and having an audience participate truly live, and grateful and energized because the Paris Center used to be called Paris Center for New Learning, and so I love it that we can learn new things from people who've been working on them for a long time. And so I feel grateful and also enriched with a new perspective on the world. So thank you, Becca, for this.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been such a dynamic and rich conversation. It's been so enjoyable to be a part of. So thank you so much, Àlex and James and everyone here, everyone for your comments and questions and your active listening and engagement. So deeply, deeply grateful. This has been a beautiful experience.
Yes, and you're welcome to come to Italy, hopefully sometime in the future.
That's like saying you're welcome to please live out your dream. Italy is probably my favorite place to go in the world.
All right.
So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome to come anytime. And thank you for joining us today, Becca. Thank you, Àlex, again for this session. And of course, thank you everyone that logged on to watch us live or on YouTube in the future. I do apologize for those who were trying to get a question in, but time did get a bit ahead of us. Before we go, I'd just like to invite you all to our next online series, which will be Beyond Bohm, which will run in July. It's our regular series. It's usually quite popular, so please get your tickets in whilst you can. As I've been hinting throughout the session, we do have Radical Visions happening here in Pari. It will start in 2 days, so if you want to see some pictures about what's been happening, do look at our Instagram. We also have our regular consciousness event coming in June with Àlex, which will also be in person. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you again soon here at the Pari Center. Bye-bye.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.